Photographic Composition, Lecture 3, Light, Part 1. By their very definition, all photographs describe light. As such, there are photographs that would be made regardless of the quality of the light that's present at the time of exposure. It may be that the events unfolding in front of the photographer are so compelling that they simply must be recorded then and there, regardless of whether the photographer was in the ideal position or the light happened to be right. Robert Capa's image of a soldier who has been knocked off his feet by the bullet that has already marked him for death is one of the most enduring in the history of the medium, completely regardless of the quality of the light. Capa's framing of the image, which suggests he had pointed his camera at the man as if for a portrait, seems almost nonchalant, underlined by the soldier's inelegant position as he flies through the air. All that can really be said about the light is that it had the decency to be relatively low in the sky and off to the right, rendering detail where there might have been little or none had this occurred at another time of day. Some would say that Capa was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. But can it truly be said of a photographer that he or she was merely lucky when they have found themselves in the right place and right time over and over again for years? This is a simple truth for photojournalists. This photograph by Eddie Adams was made in Saigon in Vietnam in 1968 and shows a police chief executing a suspect. This was considered shocking by the American public at the time. They weren't used to seeing images of a life being taken directly in front of a camera quite this boldly. The composition is not ideal, and yet it has an immediacy to it which adds a believability to the scene. This was made by Bill Epridge. It's 4 frames from a contact sheet of the death of Robert F. Kennedy. Here we see a busboy holding up Kennedy's head, and the light is clearly not particularly good. Epridge did what he could with what he had, and again, the fact that the light is rather raw and his framing a bit inelegant actually adds to the veracity of the picture. At the other end of the spectrum are photographers who have given themselves the luxury of time to create their images. National Geographic staffers have been known to build blinds facing particular bird nests and waited patiently for their prey to emerge and pose, unwittingly for their picture. This can take weeks to occur. Photographers like Edward Weston and Ansel Adams backpacked their way through the Sierras in search of images. They would stop to set up their 8x10 view cameras when struck by some inspiration and wait for the light or the clouds of the moon to position themselves in just the right way before making an exposure, if they were lucky. Of one of Adams' most celebrated images, Moonrise over Hernandez, New Mexico, made in 1941, he has said that he had finished shooting for the day and was on his way to where he was to spend the night when he saw the scene unfolding. He quickly scrambled onto the roof of his International Harvester truck, set up his camera, and exposed a single negative. His son, who was with him at the time, asked if he was going to make an additional exposure as insurance, a common practice among landscape and still life photographers. Adams said there would be no point, since in the time it took to make the first exposure, what had made it compelling had already vanished. Again, luck? Or yet another in a string of opportunities that occurred to someone consistently dedicated to his craft and ready to act appropriately when those moments presented themselves. The word photograph is from the Greek words phos, or photos, which means light, and graphos, which is drawing, thus light drawing. All photographs are engaged in the act of recording light striking a light-sensitive surface. For most of its history, this has been done through the use of light-sensitive film and paper, but is now primarily accomplished with digital sensors. William Henry Fox Talbot was one of the first to reveal the invention of photography. His process involved creating a negative, paper negative, which you see on the left. Here he placed a fern on a light-sensitive paper, which he then exposed to light, processed that, and then placed that over another sheet of light-sensitive paper and exposed that to light and got the positive that you see on the right. This process allowed him to make as many prints as he wanted from the original image. On the other hand, Louis Daguerre, who revealed his invention at the same time that Fox Talbot did his in 1839. His process allowed only one image to be made at a time. These are all unique. This one is particularly, this is the view out of his studio window, particularly, I think, a particularly nice cityscape. And even though it was the middle of the day and there were carriages and people moving around down on the street, because they were all moving, they don't show, with two exceptions. If you look in the lower left on the corner, there is a man getting his shoes shined. So he and the shoe shine were the first two people to be recorded in a photograph. David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson were Scottish photographers who worked together, and one of their specialties was portraiture. They took a lot of their portraits in direct sunlight, as this was, primarily because the emulsions were not very sensitive to light, required a lot of it to make exposures, and the cameras were also relatively slow. This is, I think, a wonderful portrait of these two gentlemen, and really only possible with a great deal of light. Not long after the invention of photography, there were a number of photographers, very enterprising, who set out from Europe primarily into the world looking for objects that had only been either seen in drawings or paintings or written about. So a likely place to go was Egypt, in this case the pyramids. One of the things that you'll see in photographs from this era, this is in the early 1850s, is human beings. They're very small in the frame, but if you look carefully, you can see there is someone standing in front of the Sphinx, and behind it is another person sitting on either a horse or a camel. You'll see these throughout these pictures because they're the only thing that really give the pyramid and the Sphinx any kind of sense of scale. Roger Fenton is considered the first war photographer, although his brand of war photography is very different from what we have come to know. Because the equipment was large and bulky and the process took a lot of time, he wouldn't get past his first shot if he were actually recording a battle. So he would go into the battlefields after the fighting had been done and photograph evidence that they had been there, in this case, a scene strewn with cannonballs. Mathew Brady was the first great American portrait photographer who decided to document the Civil War when it broke out. He had made a fortune and invested virtually all of it in creating a huge document on the Civil War, which unfortunately no one was particularly interested in at the end of it, but it is an amazing document. As you can see from this, he was working with a lens wide open, which meant that there was very little depth of field or focus. And as a result, these soldiers, these officers, are seen rather sharply in relation to the foreground and the background. Alexander Gardner, who was a photographer that Brady had hired to make a number of photographs, I believe this is either Richmond or Atlanta, after it had been sieged. And one of the interesting things about this particular image is that there had been, it looks like a man and a boy standing in the lower left-hand corner who stepped out of the image at some point during the exposure, and as a result, we actually, it looks like we're seeing through them. Timothy O'Sullivan was another one of Brady's photographers, and after the Civil War, he worked with expeditions that were exploring the American West with the intention of documenting these wonders which they had hoped to then sell Congress on the idea of starting a national parks network, which they did, and they were very impressed with the images, and funding came through quite easily. Julia Margaret Cameron was a British photographer, an amateur, who had access to well-known people at the time. She made primarily portraits. Sometimes they were of just people as they were, but very often she would put them in historical or even biblical costumes and photograph them as characters. Her attention to the light is particularly acute. This is by Frederick Evans, also a British photographer. He photographed primarily churches and cathedrals. This is called the Sea of Steps for obvious reasons, and is an absolutely gorgeous composition, I think. The dark foreground gives way to a brighter middle ground to an even brighter background, with the room at the end being much brighter than the foreground. It really leads your eye into the space. Peter Henry Emerson, also a British photographer, was primarily interested in documenting the lives of people who lived on the moors. And in the United States, Edward S. Curtis was interested in documenting the lives of Native Americans, and very often as portraits, but he would also photograph them in the landscape. Jacques-Henri Lartigue is a French photographer around the turn of the century, came from a wealthy family, and had a real gift for putting people at ease in front of the camera. As a result, he was able to capture moments that are very relaxed and a real peek into the life of wealthy Parisians at the turn of the century. Alfred Stieglitz started one of the first studios in New York to actually show photography. His intention was to elevate it to the stature of painting and sculpture. He was a great photographer in his own right, but he also championed the work of others. His best friend, Edward Steichen, was a well-known and very successful commercial photographer. He worked for magazines and corporations, but he also did work on his own. This is Versailles, supposedly taken in moonlight, although I'm suspicious of that because it looks like there's too much light on the palace itself. It's a gorgeous composition, though. There's just enough light to see what's going on in the foreground. And again, there's sort of a roadway, and it leads you back to the palace. This is by Alvin Langdon Coburn, who was also part of this group that Stieglitz began, which called themselves pictorialists. And just a remarkable image of a train in snow with great billowing smoke over it. The tones are just really fantastic. Paul Strand was also a member of this group, and he was interested in abstract compositions and shapes and shadows and on various objects, like this one. This is also Paul Strand. This is Wall Street, though, and without the presence of the people, we would have no sense of how tall these windows are. Take away the people, and they could be 2 feet tall instead of 20 feet or more. The thing that really makes this work, though, is the amazing light that's coming in from the left and the shadows that trail behind the people. This is by Gertrude Casebier, who was also a member of this group, photographed the privileged in America. This appears to be a mother and child, perhaps on a Sunday morning. The light in the far room is greater than the light in the foreground, and as a result, there's this beautiful backlighting silhouetting the 2 people.